to make cloth is to make meaning. And, weaving, spinning, they were amongst our earliest technologies. And I think they were probably amongst our earliest metaphors as well. And for most of history, what you wore was inseparable from where you came from the landscape you lived in. It encoded everything that was around you. And it's such a disconnection with what we're experiencing now, because the garments arrive with us with no story, no origin, no name attached to them. And this costs us something. We've lost that connection.
This is Carrie Summers, the renowned author of The Nature of Fashion. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN and your host of Lives of Tomorrow, where we explore how shifts in society, ethics and the economy are shaping our future. I'm going to be speaking to experts on two critical industry topics, sustainability and traceability. Joining me today is Carrie Summers, the renowned author of The Nature of Fashion, a book about fashion's historical entanglement with exploitation and its separation from nature. We're discussing a potential game changer emerging in the industry, digital product passports, or DPPs. These digital tools are set to reshape fashion by mandating full visibility and verification for every garment, driven by much stricter regulations and some consumer demand for proof of origin. We'll also discuss whether consumers genuinely care about sustainability in 2026 and what's needed to get this topic back at the top of our agendas. So, Carrie, welcome to the podcast. Let's start with you introducing yourself to our listeners.
Yes, of course. I'm Carrie Summers, and I've spent my career really at the intersection of fashion, nature and creativity, and always asking what connects the clothes we wear with where they come from. I'm probably best known for co-founding Fashion Revolution after the Rana Plaza factory collapse, which became the world's largest fashion activism movement. And before that, back in 1992, I founded Pachacuti, known for really beautiful Panama hats, pioneer of supply chain transparency and the world's first fair trade certified company. And I'm currently director of League of Artisans, and I consult for the UN's International Trade Centre. And then my book, The Nature of Fashion, was published last year, and that travels across landscapes and centuries, tracing the roots of plant fibres and dyes, and asking really what the choices of the past can tell us about where we are in fashion today.
That's a very impressive introduction. Let's jump straight into it. So for people maybe new to the concept of a digital product passport, can you explain what they are?
Of course. I mean, a digital product passport is a digital record that is attached to a product. And it's accessible via usually a label. It might have a QR code on, for example. And that contains verified information about a garment's entire life cycle. So it could have information like where the fibre came from, how and where it was processed and made. It might have its environmental footprint, care information, repair information, and options for reuse and what to do with it at the end of its life. And it's part of the EU's Eco-Design for Sustainable Product regulation. And textiles and fashion have been identified as a top priority. And in practice, this means that all of the information that is normally buried in CSR reports or on websites, and even things like care information, is often not accessible on the product itself. And this has to be made available on the product and verifiable at the product level as well.
So this is going to be a legal requirement within the EU, potentially by the end of next year.
Yes, and for brands selling into the EU as well. So it's not just EU companies, it's going to be companies in the UK, companies in the US and elsewhere in the world who want to access that EU market, which would be most major and smaller fashion brands as well.
Yeah, it will be. So no one can actually see these yet. No one's actually implemented them yet. This is still in a concept and a legal framework at this point in time.
Yes, and I don't think the final requirements have been published yet.
Okay.
We keep anticipating them later this year. And then there will probably be, 12 to 18 months for implementation and then it is a legal requirement and companies will face the consequences if they're not disclosing that information. But I think it's important to say that there's actually quite a lot of work to do. I mean, a lot of companies probably don't have this information down to a product level. And even when I was doing research recently for the crafted report that I worked on with League of Artisans and Keele University, which assessed 50 fashion and homewares brands in terms of how much they disclose about the artisans working in their supply chain. And that includes not just people who might embroider and weave some of the items, but also, the tanneries who are tanning the leather and down to other processing facilities as well. And it was really interesting how little information was disclosed at the product level, even information we'd really expect to be there.
When you're talking to people in the fashion and textile industry, what feedback are they giving you on this? Is it something that people are welcoming? Are they positive about it? Or is it something that at the moment seems to be shrouded in a bit too much secrecy?
It doesn't seem to me that most brands are taking it seriously enough or recognising how much work this is going to be, other than the luxury sector. So, I mean, looking at the crafted report and the brands who are sharing that information, the environmental footprint, it's pretty much only the luxury fashion houses and a lot of other information. So, and, information about, disposability, end of life, repair. I mean, so few companies, some do it incredibly well and they have, really detailed videos about how to care for your cashmere, how to repair it. That's the kind of information that the customers really want to see.
In all the research that we're doing at WGSN, the consumer demand for sustainability has definitely decreased. And, the kind of heyday of a few years ago when people were definitely making different product choices because of the provenance and because of the sustainability credentials from the brands has been, I don't really want to use the word washed away, but the sort of state of the world, cost of living crisis, et cetera, we could, write down the list, has definitely repositioned, I would say, consumers' priorities. Give me your take on that, because I think I can't see anyone would say this was a bad idea, but it doesn't feel like the consumers are pushing for this right at the moment.
I think it depends on what research you look at. I was at Leeds University last week, the week before, and some of the research was about what customers would want to see on the product, and a number of customers were saying that they would, really welcome something like, the traffic light system, so they would know what products were good, what products weren't so good. So I think. We know that what customers say in polls doesn't necessarily translate into reality. And I think that's why Professor Eduardo Andrade's paper is so important, because it shows that visibility is vital in shifting behaviour. And, sustainability and that criteria, it needs to be front and centre. And really, the industry has spent decades ensuring that it isn't.
Let's talk a little bit more maybe about the kind of history. And you've always argued that fashion's future is very much rooted in the kind of threads of the past. Is what we're talking about here just a more kind of technologically advanced version of your thesis here about how fashion has evolved?
Yes, I think that's a really excellent way of putting it, because the digital product passport, it's a data record, but it's also the story of where our clothes have journeyed before reaching our wardrobes and where they can potentially travel after they leave our wardrobes as well. And story is what clothes have really always been. And in my book, I open with the fact that the Latin word texere, to weave, is the root of both textiles and texts. And that's not only in Latin, because stories and cloth have really never been separate things. And my specialist area is Latin America, and I love the Mayan Popol Vuh. It's one of the great sort of creation texts of the ancient world. And it opens with a phrase that can be translated either as, "Here we shall write the story of the beginning," or "Here we shall brocade the story of the beginning." Because in the Quiche Maya, the same verb covers both acts. And it's born of that understanding that to make cloth is to make meaning. And, weaving, spinning, they were amongst our earliest technologies. And I think they were probably amongst our earliest metaphors as well. And for most of history, sort of, what you wore was inseparable from where you came from the landscape you lived in. It encoded everything that was around you. And it's such a disconnection with what we're experiencing now, because the garments arrive with us with no story, no origin, no name attached to them. And this costs us something. We've lost that connection. When I was at Fashion Revolution, we always used to say that exploitation thrives in hidden places. And that's really important to consider. And I think, done well, a digital product passport can be the start of reweaving that connection, because even though the technology is new, the needs that it answers, those human needs for connection, they are new.
I think there's something, this is just kind of coming to mind as we're talking right now, that, this probably also is a reason why the influencer network continues to grow, or the content creator influence network continues to grow, because they sort of give a story to some of these clothes in the way the kind of old fashion editors might have done, 10, 15 years ago, that now something that looks kind of faceless on a beautiful model on a screen, inevitably, now someone brings that to life. I was watching a Sheerluxe reel earlier this morning with one of their content creators who I've started following now. And the way that she talked about the clothes that she was buying at the moment and why she was buying them and how she was putting them together gave something a story. Now, it's not as beautifully kind of historical as what you've just been talking about, but it does mean that it's something other than just a jacket on a page or a pair of jeans or something like that, which is quite interesting. So I'm trying to, where the digital passport kind of fits within that, because how are we going to feel that there's a story? And, maybe that's the way that this becomes much more interesting to consumers, that this now actually might be something that they want to read and there's a provenance and, it's something that there's a talkability then, rather than it just being, well, here's something I, clicked on, put it in my basket and it arrived 48 hours later.
Yes, exactly. And, I think the repairability, if you know how to repair a garment and that information is being shared as well, it carries your stories. They're imbued in the garment as well. You can see where you fell over and you scraped the sleeve and you've repaired it and learnt to repair it, or you've sent your bag back to the manufacturers or to the brand to be repaired, maybe for the colour to be touched up or something like that. So I think, if we can keep things longer, we do become more attached to them as well, because we've carried them around, with us on our being for longer.
Yeah. My sister still wears my grandmother's dresses. I wish I could wear them. Unfortunately, my waist isn't quite small enough. But the sort of handing things down, I think there's something very special about that. And that is really being recreated with, Gen Z, with all the, resale now. My stepsons do not buy anything new. Everything comes from a resale platform. Now, they don't know who or specifically who wore it last time, but these things are kind of creating their own history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was looking at the vintage figures just yesterday. I mean, astonishing that it's sort of, the third biggest retailer in the UK, behind, a couple of the biggest, fast fashion brands. So, yeah, really interesting. I think in interviews, it was something like 38% of people had bought at least one pre-loved item in the past year.
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me at all. So what advice would you give to, I was going to say fashion, but actually any brand at the moment who is still kind of hesitant about investing in traceability?
Well, I think the first thing is that the legislation is coming and it will impact you, whatever size you are. But I think that compliance argument isn't the only reason to do that. And I think the more interesting reason, I would argue, is that the infrastructure that you're building for traceability is that same infrastructure that will make the garment's narrative available at the point of purchase. So, again, it goes back to Professor Andrade's research. And a fortnight ago, when I was at the conference in Leeds, I listened to research that tested the the habit framework. This is habit awareness and behavioural intervention training. And they worked with young fashion consumers, and it was a sort of education awareness intervention to try to disrupt fashion overconsumption.
Okay.
And it wasn't about giving people more information about environmental harm. It was about making that habit loop itself visible and helping people to see that they weren't really buying clothes. It was about chasing a feeling. And I actually noticed, I was in London yesterday and saw somebody carrying the bag from, well-known fashion retailer. And I noticed the slogan on it, "Love the feeling." And it's that, dopamine click of the scroll, the click, the package on the doorstep. It's that emotional reward system. But once you start to make that habit visible and that repetition, then their patterns shifted and the spending dropped by nearly 30%. And the extreme purchasing, sort of 6 or more items a month, dropped entirely. And I think, fashion has spent so long just engineering that friction point, all the friction points out of the purchase, because that's where the reflection happens. But actually, we want consumers, if they're really going to take sustainability seriously, we want to put some of those friction points back in, not necessarily to make the shopping experience harder, but to make it more meaningful, to tell the real story at the point of purchase, which might actually mean that the customer will buy a more expensive item. Because the research has also shown it doesn't take much for a customer then to, shift up and buy a higher priced item. So it's about changing our relationships with our clothes, with the material world, and it is a commercial opportunity.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that we are so overwhelmed with the choice that's out there at the moment. Again, not just in fashion, across all product categories, that the meaning is lost with that. And when you don't have to try in any shape or form to have something delivered, bar, working hard enough to have the money in the first place, the feeling you get is diminished. And so then people have been chasing it and they want it more often, in the hope of getting that high again at some stage in the future. And putting friction into the process, making people work that little bit harder, it does feel better. Then there is a bragging right. Anyway, we're going to pause there for a second, and we've got a few quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit better. Okay, what about your favourite AI tool?
I think the one that I use most is the plant app, Picture This, which I use for Plant ID.
Yeah.
And that's one I'm always using. I spend a lot of my time in Devon on the coast, and I'm always just checking the wildflowers. And even though I learnt a lot from my father, who knew all the names of the wildflowers, there's still so many that I don't quite know or quite remember.
We're going through all the different genres now. What's the song you currently have on repeat?
Well, I've got a song on my morning alarm. I sort of alternate between classical and something else. And currently I've got Maria Muldaur's Sweet Harmony. And it was written in 1976. And it's a song about making a better world. And, it's one of those typical 70s songs, but it's about a world where we can all belong. We can all find our place. And every morning she sings her reminder to spread joy around the world. And that's a lovely message to wake up to.
I think it's a lovely message to wake up to, and a message that is sorely needed at this moment. What's the last thing you ticked off your bucket list?
Well, in January and February, I went to Colombia. I was invited to speak at the Hay Literary Festival in Cartagena. And I also received a very special invitation to visit the indigenous Kogi in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. I have wanted to visit the Kogi since 1989, 1990, when I first met Alan Herrera, who wrote the book, made the film The Heart of the World. And I couldn't believe that I got this invitation to meet the Kogi Mamos. The trip didn't turn out quite as I'd expected. Anyone who's seen my Instagram will have seen me sort of stranded up the mountain between two really warring factions of Kogi. A couple of days mule ride from getting back, there was one stage where my husband was saying, is this a hostage situation? And with the little bit of internet I had, should I be worried? And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I will get down. But, it didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel entirely safe either. It was definitely a little bit hairy. But it was also a timely reminder not to romanticise Indigenous communities. I mean, this is something I've learned. I've spent so much time with Indigenous communities. But, the coggies somehow were different for me. This was the trip of a lifetime, and it really didn't turn out quite that way. But it's really important to remember that Indigenous peoples all have their own challenges to face as well.
Yeah, of course. Okay, we're going to get back into the topic at hand and look maybe towards the future a little bit more. So if we fast forward to, 2030, which actually isn't that far away now, what does a fully traceable fashion industry look like to you?
I think for fully traceable fashion industry, we need both systemic and cultural shifts. And in the Crafted report that we produced last year with League of Artisans and Keele University, we set out some of those changes that are needed to make this happen. So the systemic shifts include moving from output metrics to impact evaluation, going beyond carbon accounting to include water, soil, biodiversity impacts across tiers, because it was really shocking to see how few people, did things like air testing and soil testing in processing facilities. I've been to Bangladesh, I've been to the tanneries, and I've seen the effluent flowing out from the tanneries straight into the river that's home to a red listed species of river dolphin. So this is work that really needs to be done. And we need to see them moving from compliance to collaboration, investing in co-developed solutions. I work a lot with producers who have very low levels of literacy. So it's like, well, how do we create solutions that do actually work for people like that are more visual, that do work for people who haven't even finished primary education. But I think it's also the cultural shift where that real transformation could lie. So moving from product-centric to process-centric, valuing not only what is made but how it's made as well. And from environmental compliance to environmental culture, and learning from those communities who are already practicing sustainability rooted in local knowledge. And I think most fundamentally, moving from the customer as a consumer to the customer as an informed actor. And the DPP will be very much part of that.
I still think people want to do the right thing. I don't think that we have sort of large swathes of the fashion industry who are anti-sustainability. I think that we've got large swathes of the fashion industry, in fact, pretty much every industry, who need to turn a profit to remain viable. And you're going to kind of use whatever you can at your fingertips to do that. But even as we're talking, I'm kind of thinking about other industries and how, a lot of this is just ingrained. I mean, if you look at the food industry, you can't sell a food product unless you can show the traceability of those products. That's just, it's ingrained in it. And there's so much legislation around it. So, I guess if we're kind of, if this is becoming the nutritional label equivalent for fashion, when you think about it that way, it doesn't actually sound so complicated. It doesn't sound quite so difficult. But I guess it will change the shopping experience to a certain extent.
Yes, it will. I think that food nutritional label parallel is really interesting and instructive as well. And the reason that we check food labels is that we've been educated to connect food with our bodies. And I still don't think we've made that connection between clothes and human body, human health in the same way. But we must. And, I think, again, the DPP, the digital product passport, will help with this because it's likely to require information on the presence and concentration of substances of concern following the REACH standards. And I've long argued that people who won't change their shopping behaviour for our planet will do so once they start to understand the impact of toxic chemicals on human health and fertility, on their children, on their grandchildren. And fibres from our clothes are found everywhere. And I see so much, especially on social media, just suggesting it's a simple material swap that's needed away from synthetics to natural fibres, because natural fibres biodegrade and people think that they don't cause harm, ignoring all of the toxic chemicals that are also put on, sort of natural fibres and man-made cellulosics as well. And unfortunately, it's not that simple.
Okay, Carrie, this is gonna be a very difficult last question, but with everything that we've spoken about, are you more anxious or hopeful about the future?
I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. And, I think it was a great challenge, actually. When I wrote The Nature of Fashion, my editor at Chelsea Green said, I want this to be a hopeful book. And in every story, even the darkest ones, I try to draw some elements of hope, whether that's weaving the story through into the future or taking, lessons from it. Because history does hold important lessons for the future. And I found so many strands of hope and resilience. And, from communities preserving craft to those innovators who are developing new plant-based fibres. And it will mean dismantling many of those practices that have become normalised and creating new systems that recognise the interconnectedness of all living things. But I think that's a really exciting place to be heading to. And I think it's a joyful place, as you were saying as well.
Carrie, thank you so much. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. I think there's definitely some things that are going to make me think twice about some choices that I'll make. And it will be fascinating to see how these DPPs evolve. And when we actually start seeing them on our the labels in the back of our clothes, hopefully in the not too distant future. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Carla.
A big thank you to today's guest, Carrie Summers, author of The Nature of Fashion. Do check out our other podcast, Create Tomorrow, with my colleague Cassandra Napoli. But that's it from me for now. I'll return with a new episode of Lives of Tomorrow in 14 days. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN, and I'll see you next time.